Well, good day, and welcome to the latest episode of the Mansplainers. I'm here today with a male space and our special guest. We are very pleased to have the legendary F. Roger Devlin, the author of a number of provocative and stimulating articles and collected in a book that's well known now, Sexual Utopia in Power. And I think Roger Devlin has not been the internet presence that he could be. I think he would be better known, but he's certainly got a very devoted fan base. Bradley, do you want to say a few words and introduce Roger more extensively?
Yes, I would like to do that. I came across, I don't even remember how I stumbled upon it. I remember stumbling upon articles by Roger on the internet, and then I eventually discovered his book, Sexual Utopia and Power. And inside Sexual Utopia and Power, there's an essay called Rotating Polyandry. It's Rotating Polyandry and its Enforcers, in which Roger referenced you, and then I came across your books. And ever since then, I've read both of your material, your articles and books, and both of you have had an enormous impact on me regarding my male experience in the current day, regarding sexual politics and sexuality and talk on the sexual market. And I do exhort, as usual, for men to get both of your books. Here's Sexual Utopia and Power by Roger Devlin and Taken into Custody by Dr. Baskerville. And I think that men ignore your books and your articles at their peril. So for your well-being out there, get their books and read their articles. So we're going to take it away now.
Roger, welcome to the show.
Thank
It's good to
you.
have you here. I don't know if you wanted to start out and say a few words. I think a lot of rereading your books, your book in the last week, and a couple other articles, more recent ones. One thing that really strikes me is that things that I now hear almost commonplace in the manosphere, all arguments are that you were writing these things back in 2000 when the book was published in 2015, or perhaps even earlier, as early as 2008, I believe. And yet,
My first essay, Sexual Utopia and Power, was actually published in the summer of 2006. Yeah.
okay. Well, am I correct about that? That these things that you were saying, 10 years ago or more than 10
20
years
years
ago,
ago. Yeah.
20 years ago, have now become almost commonplace in the manosphere and among men and women. I don't see a lot of credit to you, quite frankly, for this,
Yeah.
but perhaps my perception is wrong.
Well, I would say I'm not surprised to hear you say that you found my ideas everywhere, but it's not necessarily because of my direct influence. Uh, I Human nature, sexual mores change, human nature doesn't. I kind of saw where this was going, and more people are seeing it now. Basically, the big insight I had, it was something pretty simple. I read. I'm one of those well-rounded people, meaning I know a little bit about a lot of things. And if you've ever read anything on animal behavior, like primate behavior, you know the language about alpha males and the females trying to mate with the alpha males and the males trying to become alpha males. Basically, my insight was that when you get rid of marriage and socially enforced monogamy, what you're going to get is not going to be some kind of endless Woodstock festival or free for all. In fact, you're not really going to get promiscuity. You're going to get what I call Darwinian mating. You're going to get a system where most guys are desperate for a woman, but all of the women are aggressively pursuing a rather small number of men. And I figured this out about 20 years ago, and now in the age of internet dating, it can be documented.
Oh,
People do objective studies about human behavior on these dating sites, and they discover that almost all the female attention is going to a small number of men. Listen to any woman say what she wants in a man, and they all say about the same thing. They all want a tall, dark, and handsome man who earns a lot of money, enjoys a lot of status. And it's just in the nature of things that there aren't going to be very many of these men. And so, most women are going to fail in their efforts to get such a man to, as they like to put it, commit to them. In fact, the higher you raise the standards, the fewer men match. And so, uh, something like 15 or 20% of the men, maybe fewer, get most of the female attention online. And it should be obvious, just from simple math, that it's not going to be possible for these women all to snag these men, unless, of course, they're willing to share them. But it's, the men cannot possibly commit to all the women who want them, even if they wanted to. Some woman just has to marry an ordinary man if she wants to get married badly enough. And that's really the way it's always been. The real difference between the pre-sexual revolution mating market and today's is that in the past, people didn't really expect all that much out of life. Like there was a world in which if you were an average guy, you could reasonably expect to find yourself an average girl without too much difficulty. Now, if you insisted on Helen of Troy, then that was a problem, of course. You probably wouldn't succeed. But an ordinary guy could expect to get an ordinary girl. And ultimately, as parents used to tell their lovelorn offspring, for every boy there's a girl, for every girl there's a boy. So almost everybody who wanted to get married badly enough could do so. That's still the way it is, but you know, decades of sexual utopianism has, first it had men convinced that they should be able to score with lots of girls, and then now it's got women convinced that they should be able to get the rarest sort of combination of qualities, and they should be able to, all get the men who have all of those qualities.
Yes, that is what occurs. Now, from my understanding, that this was corrected from enforced monogamy, because as you said in your book, that when the institution of monogamous marriage breaks down, what we see is the strengthening of the already strong, meaning that the people who are attractive become strengthened at the expense of the unattractive.
Yes.
This scene strengthens the female at the expense of the male. And there is some talk online going on. For example, there's that internet famous lawyer, James Sexton, who frequently says that marriage is an outdated technology, so to speak. But without the institution of marriage, then where do we go from there? And also, if there is no institution of marriage, there are no fathers. What kind of effects? What kind of effects does this have if we do not have enforced monogamy? What is that? How does it affect childbearing, child raising, and why do men keep us saying that marriage is outdated when actually enforced monogamous marriage prevents these problems that we're going over?
Well, marriage is a timeless institution. That's what I believe. Certainly, what's falsely called marriage now, marriage as long as the woman doesn't get bored, that you know that it's that marriage that men are avoiding. It's as Stephen says, it's a fraudulent contract. But actual marriage, where the woman, the man does his best to provide for the woman, and the woman is grateful for what she gets, and doesn't demand more. That is a timeless institution, and if it's obsolete, then our civilization is obsolete, because you can't have a civilization without families.
Right, but the argument and go ahead, Stephen.
I was going to say I agree with you completely on that, and unfortunately, what Bradley said, how you've summarized it, Bradley. Marriage is an outdated institution. Too many men nowadays are subscribing to that. They don't. I don't think they realize what they're accepting. They shouldn't be conceding that because, as you say, marriage provides for fathers, allows children to fathers. You've said this. You've elaborated on it. I've said it. Daniel Ananias has said it. I think some of the best writers recognize this, but this insistence that on cohabiting, having children out of wedlock, I think men are kind of cutting their own throats. But go on, carry on.
Oh, okay. Roger, go ahead if you have anything.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, the there are two ways that men can mate. There are two basic strategies. You can follow like a short-term strategy where you try to impregnate as many women as possible, or you can follow a long-term strategy where you try to find one good girl and invest heavily in them. And civilization is built on persuading as many men as possible to follow a good girl mating strategy. To find and carefully choose one girl and invest heavily in her. There is a problem with this, which is, pretty obvious, namely, not all girls are good. Some guys have bad luck and they get caught with an unfaithful woman, but that doesn't mean that there's a problem with the institution of marriage. That doesn't mean that there's a problem with the idea of a good girl and a faithful wife. The shortcoming is on the part of the woman in that case. One of the things that used to be done to protect monogamy was that young girls were oversold. Uh, this sort of pretense developed that every young girl is something wonderful. And every guy that got engaged, everybody would slap him in the back and tell him, "You're such a lucky fella," as if he were like the first guy in the history of the world to get married and have sex or something. Uh, and this is the thinking that goes that's behind the white knightery of the gallant old-fashioned conservatives who are totally unable to deal with sexual dysfunction as it exists in society today. There's gotten to be a real shortage of good girls. Back in the day, when sexual utopianism, do you want to speak, Stephen? Back in
No,
the
go ahead.
day,
Go ahead.
back in the day when male sexual utopianism was being monetized by Hugh Hefner and his ilk, uh, it was what men thought was there was like this untapped reservoir of female libido out there. If we just stop enforcing marriage and give women the right to mate as they please, the female libido will extend. The constrictions that have been limiting it to marriage will be eliminated, and female libido will like a gas, it'll expand to fill the greater available space, and so there will be more sex for men. That was the idea. That was the program of substituting uh, consenting adults and freedom and sex as an entirely personal matter, of substituting that for monogamy, lifelong monogamy. Well, what actually happens, of course, is that without marriage, the women's attention is all, it doesn't expand, it actually contracts. Their focus contracts to just a few men. And this can be observed in primitive tribes. It's like among the Bushmen of the Kalahari and other, very, very simple societies. Most men do not become fathers. 60% of men fail to reproduce. All the reproducing is done by a minority of the men. And that is what reemerges. Not more sex and it's amazing how many of these old-fashioned conservatives still believe that men today have more sex available to them than before. The purpose of monogamy is not to deny, is not to restrict the amount of sex available to men, but to get sex, and more importantly, wives and families, for as many men as possible. Fools think that polygamy is a system where men are allowed to have more than one woman. Wise people understand that polygamy is a system where a tiny number of elite men, elite in wealth or power or social prestige, whatever, where they are allowed to have more than one woman at the expense of other men farther down the social hierarchy. And that is what happens when marriage disappears. Something that was previously available to the great majority of people who wanted it enough only becomes available on temporary loan to a few highly attractive people, basically, especially to a few highly attractive men.
Steve, would you like to go
I'd
ahead?
like to
Yeah.
unpack that. Yeah, if I could, I'd like to pack that a little further because the thing about your work that first grabbed my attention years ago was this your critique of the traditional conservatives. I mean, I was just discovering this when I wrote Taken into Custody. I was connected with a number of these traditional conservative pro-family groups. I'd come from the left, I'd gone to the right, and so I actually heard all the rhetoric, and I thought, okay, well, I'm going to connect these guys, and I'm going to and women, and I'm going to show them what's really causing the breakdown of their family, and they're going to all jump on board, and we're going to solve this problem once and for all. I was getting, nobody was talking about this, but at least nobody that anyone heard. But then I was getting nowhere. I was getting frustrated, and I read your critique of this because this insight of yours, as you just now outlined it, is really quite. The implications are kind of diabolical in the sense that the perceptions of it, the way it's perceived by the larger world of traditional conservatives and through them the larger society, is a kind of double or more vilification of men. On the one hand,
Right.
the elite men are excoriated for refusing to commit, for refusing to for preying on women, for being sexual predators and love, hump and dump and all this. So they're criticized for being for that, and then the other 80% or so are excoriated for being, well, they're humiliated. They're called, which we used to call them bachelors. Nowadays they're called incels,
Right.
which is another kind of degrading term, I think, in many ways. And they're, of course, the brunt of accusations of being, sexual harassers
Right.
and
No,
and
nobody's accusing the
stalkers,
Hollywood movie
just for
stars of
being
being sexual harassers.
precisely. And this is often pointed out. People do notice this, that, if the woman wants the man, if she finds him attractive, then it's not harassment. It's all in the perception. The crime is in the perception of the woman. So this is an optical illusion, what we've resulted in this. I mean, your insight needs to get out there so that people understand the dynamic and the logic that's working here, and not just go through this knee-jerk, reflexive condemnation of virtually every man.
Right. Yeah, this was the original inspiration that made me sit down and write out my original essay, Sexual Utopia and Power. I was reading Chronicles at the time, and Chronicles editors would go on and on and on about male predators, their mental image of what was. See, the most fundamental thing about sex and sexual dynamics is really the weakness of the man's position, that we produce the abundant resource, sperm, and women produce the scarce resource, eggs. And that puts women about 99% of the way in charge of when mating takes place, how mating takes place. And this is why, in a traditional society, sexual it was primarily the woman's responsibility to be the enforcer of monogamy and to guide men into a monogamous relationship. And this is something very unusual because in almost every other aspect of life, it's men who have the responsibility. Women get cared for, they get taken care of. But women were put in charge of enforcing monogamy for the simple reason that we men are not very good at it. Young men are just desperate for sex. The scarcity of eggs and the choosiness of women virtually forces men to be sexual opportunists. Like, right, if you're a young man, if and rule number one is don't pass up a mating opportunity. Because if for the average young man, you don't get that many. If you're not a Hollywood movie star or a billionaire, mating opportunities don't come along that often. So men are practically forced to be opportunists and to, not say no to a woman. And this is something somehow these older men don't understand this. I think they think that they chose their wives, not understanding that, it was the wife who chose them. If you grew up before the sexual revolution, it wasn't that hard to get a wife. And so they thought it was pretty easy for a guy to get a woman, and they imagine that it's much easier now, when in fact, for the majority of men, it's harder. So they think that's where the vision of the predator, the male predator, comes in. They imagine that younger men have it easier. That's what everybody said in the 1970s. More sex. There's more sex now because we got rid of socially enforced monogamy.
Yes.
Some people still believe it. And when I actually made a rather pathetic attempt to introduce some of the people at Chronicles, introduce my ideas to them, and I got immediately shouted down as a misogynist and somebody who was upset at his girlfriend and, just ad hominem abuse. And these a lot of these guys, they're happy with this sort of gallant view of women as naturally good, and they're not going to budge from it.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, go on, Bradley.
You see, that's that. I recall that article that I'm very fond of, the article in which you critiqued, I'm not critiqued, reviewed the new politics of sex by Stephen. It was called "Decriminalization of Masculinity." It was featured on Unst.com. And if I recall, you introduced the article by saying that the conservative commentariat has been putting men to sleep. Because those of us who know, I mean, I'm a Gen Xer, we already knew the deal by the 1990s when we were in our teens and 20s of what's going on here. So with that said, also, you did say in Sexual Utopia and Power that like inflation, sexual liberation turns the market morally upside down by actively punishing the virtuous and rewarding the vicious. Can you elaborate on that phenomenon?
Yeah, well, the minority of men who actually are cads tend to succeed better with women. Men who actually, accompany a woman to the altar and try to start a family, they're punished for doing that. It's probably true for women too. I suppose the sexual revolution was good for sluts. If you want to, if you really just want to do it with as many attractive men as you can find, then it's a benefit. But it hasn't been very good for girls that were actually interested in starting a family. And within marriage, of course, it means that the power is with the person who wants to leave. The power is with the irresponsible party, which is usually the woman, but occasionally the man. And the person who's willing to break up the marriage basically decides, it ends up being in charge of the family. When it's a woman, a very unnatural position arises. I've read horror stories about women who will start filling out divorce papers whenever their husband doesn't do exactly what they want. And the husband just has to give in. So basically the woman in this family has become the head of the family. She's become the husband and turned her poor husband into a wife, an obedient wife, more obedient than actual wives. So yeah, it is a moral inversion. The whole point of monogamy was to connect sex with virtues such as loyalty, and it protects the interest of those who want to make a marriage work, who want to keep a family together. It doesn't prevent anybody from leaving. You know, if dad insists on running off with a chorus girl, he can do that, but you know, he can't just the court can intervene and make sure that he supports his children. And if mom wants to run away, she can do that. A marriage is not supposed to be a prison, but she can't take the children with her, and she can't continue to extract resources from her husband on the basis of a bond that she has broken.
Right. That's
It is the
exactly.
ultimate in the politics of perverse incentives. In other contexts, people are happy to talk about the perverse incentives of welfare and so on, but this current marriage law and family law, such as it is sort of the most extreme case of a politics of perverse incentives that you can imagine.
Yeah, and what you just, I mean, the sound principles you just outlined are basically consistent with the common law and basic legal principles that you don't act against people who haven't done anything legally wrong. You have to do something legally wrong, if not criminal, at least civil, at least breaking the marriage
Mhm.
contract, before the state and the courts can act against you and take control of your private life and your children and so forth. Um, so
Right.
it's yeah, what you were saying, a couple of things that occurred to me. You said about the this misconception of the tradcons that men are out there all having all kinds of sex, and all the sexual revolution started with Playboy magazine. Well, you mentioned Hugh Hefner, but I remember when Hugh Hefner, in the early years of the sexual revolution, he saw the feminists as allies. He
Oh
thought they
yeah.
were on the same side. They thought they were all wanted to throw the marriage out the window and the prudery out the window and have free love, as we called it, free sex. And then everybody was seemed to be having this great utopia. And then the feminists turned against him. They called him an oppressor of women. They came out and he was completely blindsided. He had no idea that this was coming, and he said so.
Mm.
And so, here, so this to me represents the two sides of the sexual revolution: the kind of libertarian side, which I think the men did play a role in early on, especially,
Yes.
and then the authoritarian side, which the feminists
Pretty much all
are
female.
more, yeah, exactly. In fact, you point this out at one point yourself. You also allude to the French Revolution and
Yes.
the rights of man. First, the rights of man, and then the reign of terror.
That's right. That's right. It's a two-phase movement. Exactly. So, you know, as I say, people casually throw around expressions like sexual revolution, but one of the point of my original essay was it really presents serious analogies with serious political revolutions, such as the French and Russian Revolution. It was a two-stage affair with a libertarian phase of tearing down old ways, and then a terror phase when society just got to be unmanageable in a state of anarchy. You know, rules of some kind are necessary. So, you know, the people who are the most ruthless in a revolutionary situation, the people who are most united and most ruthless are the ones who succeed in imposing their will as the new rules. And obviously, that's been the feminists in the case of the sexual revolution.
Yeah, and it's no accident, I think, that both of those, especially those terroristic revolutions, the French and the Russian, feminism was emerged in both of those.
Yes,
They were it was in the margins for the most part. They were eclipsed to some extent by the mainstream of the revolution, but they were
but
they were they
it
were
was very it
present.
was explicit in the case of Marxism. Do you know that the February Revolution in 1916 began on International Women's Day? The first violence in Petrograd was in connection with a feminist parade celebrating International Women's Day. And then that grew into 4 days of disorder, and within a week, the Romanovs were gone. That's a little known bit of historical trivia. Yeah, feminism was not dominant, but it was really clear that, Alexandra Kollontai, the Bolshevik woman, was a advocate of free love. She's the one.
Uh,
She's the one who said that satisfying the need for love should be as simple as satisfying thirst by drinking a glass of water. To which Lenin is said to have responded that when he's thirsty, he preferred to drink from a glass without other men's lip marks all over it. But
yeah, Lenin called a halt to it. Lenin and
yeah,
Stalin
yeah, yeah.
after,
Well, and in the
ironically.
20, there was a phase of easy divorce. I mean, there were even weird cases of like farmers who would marry, quote unquote, big strapping wenches to take in the harvest and then divorce them when the harvest was over. I mean, crazy stuff like this happened. And it was found to be intolerable. And so certainly by the time Stalin was in charge, people had gone back to basically enforcing marriage again.
So what we're dealing with today in the 21st century West, what emerged really in, I suppose, first in California in some ways, in the 20th century, is a social and a political movement that was too radical for the Jacobins, too radical for the Bolsheviks, but
Yes.
we managed to enact it in the 1960s and in the aftermath of it. So I think that puts it into perspective.
Yes, yes. Few things are more fundamental than sex and the family. It's certainly more fundamental than the market. People make fun of the Bolsheviks for ignoring economic self-interest, but ignoring the sexual nature of man and trying to substitute utopian ideas, that is more radical, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that is more destructive to society. And now that we're on the conservatives, what I wanted to continue with is that do conservatives discuss female sexuality as if women have no agency? For example,
Yes.
we'll usually hear stories about women, quote, being lured into
Yes.
pornography, or if a woman goes with a high status man, for example, her professor, and there is actual sexual attraction, after that dies down, no one knows how she wound up with this man. Meaning
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that he took advantage of her when in
Yes,
fact
yeah.
she was attracted to him because of his high status.
Because of his status, exactly. Condemning men for using status to get a woman is like condemning a young woman for using her pretty face to find a husband. You're
Yes.
basically attacking the nature of heterosexual attraction at its fundamental level. You're an ally of Andrea Dworkin and trying to abolish sex altogether at that point. And it's amazing how people fall for it. Bill Clinton taking advantage of poor innocent Monica Lewinsky, who, I mean, it was embarrassed. They say everybody who worked at the White House saw this coming a mile off. It was just obvious that she was going after the president for weeks
Yes.
before she finally succeeded. And then, of course, Bill Clinton gets the blame because he's a man.
Yes, and we can see also that, for example, even with platforms like OnlyFans, there's no manager, there's no middleman trying to get this
Yeah.
up. There's no agent. Women just have a camera like we have here, and that's by their own volition.
Yes, yeah, yes. I've read a bit of like polemics against pornography from the old days. There was a book called The Skin Peddlers, I think, that was written back in the 1960s. When in those days, pornography was often controlled by organized crime. Hugh Hefner was a bit of a revolutionary in the public publishing industry and bringing you know, titillating nude photography to the masses in an above board way. And in these old fashioned polemics, uh, there are no bad girls. The girls, right, the girls who pose or for pornographic magazines are lured into it by these evil Svengalis, the male pornographers. Now, I don't want to be taken as, being an apologist for male pornographers. I'm sure that most of them are not very nice people, and they're certainly not thinking about the well-being of the women that they're working with. Nevertheless, there doesn't seem to be any problem of girls not volunteering for porn. That just doesn't happen. I'm told that out in California, they'll have porn tryouts and girls will show up in a line around the block. They want to be porn whores. That's like that's their ambition. There's there's no shortage of women like that. They don't have to be lured by men. I don't
Right.
know why. I mean, but that it surprises me that so many women would actually go in for this kind of thing. But one point that I should make is exhibitionism is one of the few sexual perversions that is more common in women than in men. So, in some cases, although most porn whores, I'm sure, just do it for the money, there are a certain number that get some kind of thrill out of making a public spectacle of themselves as well. So, yeah, women don't have to be lured.
Well,
And
yeah.
you can't lure a woman who doesn't want to be lured. Let's put it that way.
Right, and on a on a gentler level, if you like, a level down. I mean, there is, the whole sexual revolution has done something of it about face. And if we remember back, when we were young, when it started, they were talking about objecting to women being made into sex objects. Women are being sex objects. Well, nowadays, it seems women want to be sex objects, not just OnlyFans and prostitutes, but just ordinary women seem to want to be, as you say, are engaged in routine exhibitionism. Some people argue, for example, that the entire fashion industry is kind of a major honey trap in which caters to women who want to exhibit their bodies sexually. And of course, we also know that the fashion industry and all these kind of stereotypical feminine industries, fashion, cosmetics, lingerie, all of these things, they are major funders of feminist groups. So, this whole complaint about wanting to be sex objects, well, looks like nowadays they seem quite happy to be sex objects, and being sex objects is quite lucrative also.
Yes, yes. They don't know what they want. I mean, they accusing a man of thinking of you as a sex object is a good way of getting rid of him if you don't find him attractive too. I imagine that the Hollywood movie stars don't get accused of thinking of women as sex objects. If a woman can get a really handsome, high status man to think of her at all, she's not going to complain that it's as a sex object. She'll just be happy that he's thinking of her at all. But this talk, it just gives women ammunition for dismissing men that they don't want. They can say, "Oh well, he thinks of me as a sex object."
Yes.
Yeah. Going back to the TradCons for a moment, I remember you mentioned Chronicles magazine. The great irony of that, of course, is that Chronicles sees itself as a dissident right-wing magazine. It's not mainstream. It's not neocon or it's
Right.
they engage in quite strong criticisms of the establishment right, or what they call conservatism Inc.
That's what originally attracted me to them.
Right.
I liked their critique of the foreign policy, conservative so-called foreign policy establishment. But in regard to women and the sexual revolution, it was the opposite. The neocons, they actually published some pretty good articles in the 90s, decrying the conceptual expansion of sexual harassment to cover anything any woman might not like. They were on the ball on this, and the people at Chronicles they seem to think that the world had stopped in 1969, and when the girls started putting out on the college campus, and there was all this free love ideology, and they seemed just totally unaware of the phase of what I call the phase of sexual terror, where men were being scapegoated for perfectly ordinary desires that they can't help, and that they've been given, largely for the benefit of women.
Right. I should add quickly here that Chronicles nowadays is under new management, and I write for them
Yes.
occasionally, and they have published some of my articles on
Yes, I
precisely
know.
these
Yeah.
topics. So they can't be blamed entirely for the sins of
No,
their predecessors.
no, it was
But
much of the inspiration for my work actually comes from the density of Thomas Fleming and a few of his colleagues. See, I read the publication mainly from 1997 until shortly after Sam Francis's death. Sam was my favorite writer for them. Yeah, I loved him on all kinds of subjects. He didn't talk about the sexual revolution much, but the others did. And what they said was it was stuck in 1969, and it was stuck in sort of a gallant traditional understanding of womanhood that was totally uninformed by an actual understanding of female sexuality. I
right.
think a lot of those guys, their whole understanding of women was just women want to marry morally upright men. They
Yeah,
just didn't understand. Women are just as much under the control of their sex instincts as men are, possibly more so. We have to control our sexual instincts, or we get in trouble real fast.
right.
Women have greater latitude to do as they please, which usually means, screwing up.
What's especially strange too to me is that not just the mainstream tradcons, but especially those who claim to be standing up for the family. There's a number of these groups that specifically claim that they want to rescue focus on the Family Research Council, and they just ignore all of this. I see that you did review Alan Carlson's book
Hmm.
um, in your Third Ways, which is a fascinating study. I worked with Alan Carlson for a number of years.
Yes,
I respect him very much, and I could see that he tried to push. He published my work, and
yes, yes, I know.
he tried to push back a little bit on that. And he was, obviously a genuine intellectual. And but even there, I know he got pushback from within the other conservative organizations,
Yes, I'm
including
sure.
those that claim to be devoted to saving the family. It's
Right.
just absolutely bizarre.
The first chapter of Third Ways was very influential on me. It's you know most of professional economics is so distant from how people actually live. And this was a very simple essay showing how men's economic position has been eroded by women entering the workforce. It is a big, uh, you know, let me put it this way. Men go to work because they want a woman and they want, eventually they want to have children. Women go to work so as not to need a man. So there's a fundamental conflict there. You can't treat male and female labor in the marketplace as equivalent, as the feminists do. They're almost directly opposed to each other.
Yeah,
And if you want families, if you want big families, you have to protect the man's position as an earner. And that means, women may not be completely free to compete against men in the workplace on equal terms.
yeah, and even
That's one of the most important insights, I think.
absolutely. And you point out, and Carlson points out that socialist groups, labor unions, and that were tried to keep women out of the workforce because they lowered the wages. They eroded men's wages. And I thought your chapter on economics of the family, I forget the title, home economics or something like
Yes,
that.
yeah. In Sexual Utopia, I did an essay called Home Economics, and then in my upcoming book, there's a speech I gave in Finland, which deals again with some of this same stuff, the economic basis of marriage.
It's very, very important. I mean, you mentioned a couple of points. Well, you really systematically deal with a number of things which I have hinted at, but never developed. And the fact that the very concept, the very word economics comes from the Greek word for
Right.
household management, or oikonomia.
Yes.
Was the management and early. The fact that we called it political economy was something that
Right.
it was originally economics meant you didn't have to say home economics. Economics, that was the only
Yes,
kind of
exactly,
economics.
exactly.
Um,
Yeah. And yeah, this is why in the age of Adam Smith, they use the expression political economy to refer to what we call economics.
yeah,
Yes.
and so nobody doubted. And we're planning, by the way, we've had some guests, and we're planning to have more on the subject of economics. I don't know if you're familiar with Shaw's work. This is Shaw. He goes by on the internet. He talks about the history of bride price
Yeah.
and dowry, which is a fascinating history. We're hoping to have him on in a couple of weeks. But this nobody doubted the family was an economic. Nobody had this romantic illusions about wedding cakes and fluffy dresses and all this. It was a hard nosed negotiation between the groom usually and the bride's father. It involved changing hands, and it was you would never dream of going into a marriage or sending your daughter into a marriage without having these things worked out and understood. You certainly wouldn't leave them to the bride and groom by themselves, or to their emotions, to their feelings.
Right, right. They're
Uh,
too young to understand, the economics of marriage. They only understand their own feelings. That's right.
and
Yes.
we've just forgotten all of this. So much of this would have been commonplace, would have been understood. Marriage is a union of two extended families, not just two individuals.
I was
And we've
influenced by Carlson's definition of marriage as a sexual and economic union between a man and a woman. And one effect of the sexual revolution is that we focus obsessively on sex, which is the woman's natural strong point, and tend to forget economics, which ought to be the man's. Now, it is the man's naturally strong point, but if an economy has been turned upside down by feminist legislation, eventually you arrive at a point where the women are out earning the men. They don't see the men as potential mates for that reason, and it's just a mess. There are several cities I understand in the United States now where women in general are out earning men. If these
yeah, no,
women want to get married so damn much, why don't they, pay to take us out? Or this is kind of silly, I guess, but it certainly the men who are on strike or on the marriage strike, they ought to there's a lot to be said that they can say in their favor. The women are out earning us mostly thanks to a feminist thumb on the scale, quotas and all that. Let them make their own money. Let them pay their own bills. They've been telling us that a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle. So, let them live by themselves. There's nothing radically new about spinsterhood, obviously. These women, in effect, are choosing to be spinsters. Let them be spinsters.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. We can
But
do the best of
the
everything.
women, what happens is the women end up sexually frustrated. This is another point that you would never find the trad cons writing about. The trad cons want to write about horrible, horrible men forcing themselves on women. One man, Henry Mackow, wrote an essay called The Effects of Sexual Deprivation on Women. What if we are actually living in an age of massive female sexual deprivation? And there's a lot of evidence that that there are literally, just physically sexually frustrated women out there. They're frustrated for a number of reasons. They're earning so much they can't possibly consider a man who earns less than them. And then they're all reading Cosmo and actually believing in this promise that they're all going to get movie stars and have an exciting love life. And they don't realize that the promises are false until their mid 30s or so. So you get a lot of women who are quite literally sexually frustrated.
Yeah,
Yes.
They're not all sluts. Another thing that tradcons think is the women are all sluts. They're all putting out right and left. Well, some are. There are more sluts than there used to be. But there are also a lot of frustrated spinsters who have kind of priced themselves out of the market. They spend their lives dreaming, reading romance novels, dreaming about impossibly perfect men, and passing up on the chance to meet a real imperfect man and start a family with him.
Uh,
Yes. On that note, I want to address the essay by you in Sexual Utopia and Power, the book called The Question of Female Masochism. And this is one of the talking points that I wanted to address with us is that I've seen this sort of contradiction also, and you addressed it in that essay, saying that when we do have a society where men, for example, become emasculated, withdraw, it results in that frustration. Meaning that when we have a society, I don't remember the specific quote, but when you said that when men fail to dominate society, the women wind up frustrated. And also, what I've
Yeah.
noticed by another writer who I don't want to mention here for our own well-being on YouTube, he did point out in the early, you might know, I'm sure you know who he is. In the early 80s, he pointed out that even feminist women from egalitarian societies, let's say Scandinavian societies, the United States, Germany, Canada, these were feminists who were actually going to countries for men who didn't know what feminism was.
Yes.
Men that were dangerous, men that were
Yes.
bravado. So what is going on here? So they're complaining about patriarchy, but then when men remove their sort of paternal authority, there's this frustration. So what is going on here? Why would they complain about patriarchy, but then go to erotic novels about gang members, drug
Yes.
dealers,
Right.
you know, uh,
Pirates, bands, and
yes,
being kidnapped by
yes,
pirates. And
yes. So what's going on here with this contradiction? Do you have anything to say to that?
well, yeah, I mean, it's women's instincts are amazingly primitive. The female sex instinct is just as primal, it's just as primitive as the male. And women have always, all through our evolutionary history, they've been dependent on these creatures who are a lot more muscular than they are. And so some one thing that strikes them as manly is simply the ability to use force, even
Yes,
if they don't literally want to get beaten up by the man. The thought that their man could make short work of them physically, I think is very exciting to many women. I like to recommend the movie Swept Away, the 1974 Italian movie Swept Away, which is just it was made by a woman. It could only have been made by a woman, and it deals with this exactly: a spoiled woman who always gets her way and finally finds herself at the mercy of a rather old-fashioned guy who can give her a crack whenever he wants to, and pretty soon she's worshiping the guy. You
yes.
know.
Yeah, because as I was saying, I've actually shared that essay with several of my friends, and as I said to you before, we grew up as latchkey kids, so there was no, pretty much very little social law and order. So when I show that essay to my friends, everybody just starts cracking up because they say, "Well, that is true." But then if you show it to these kind of trad cons or people who grew up in, let's say, more comfortable environments, they'll say, "Oh no, only trashy women want that. Good girls don't want that." But then we're the ones who live this. We lived it up close.
Right. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, if civilized male domination is not available, they'll go for uncivilized male domination before they'll go for a man who refuses to dominate.
Yes.
that's an interesting phenomenon. Yeah, I'm still trying to make sense a little bit of how that plays out. These Western women who go off to Islamic countries and marry jihadists and
Yeah.
marry who are because they want a real man.
Yeah.
Um, this is a very interesting. Somebody says there's a good book to be written in this, and why it is that women actually play a huge role in these radical movements, radical Islamism, for example, and something that's kind of timely right now was the Iranian Revolution of 1979. We hear a huge amount about, and the Americans and the West. One of the reasons we hate Iran is because of this anti-American, religiously extremist revolution. But women played a huge role in that revolution. They were often armed. They were often in leadership positions. They were spokeswomen for the radical cause, and it's very interesting. I don't expect to make sense of it now, but it's there's something going on there. There's somebody's trying
Oh,
to get
sure.
around the Islamic prohibitions, at the least.
Yes. And Stephen, as we were talking about before, you wanted to address the subject of hypergamy, and I don't think that we're going to have. Uh, we cannot ignore the subject of hypergamy, and also it is a very popular topic of discussion. Stephen, what would you like to address with Roger? Because we've read the chapter hypergamy in Dr. Dale Limnaeus's book, The Case for Father Custody.
Right. He, as far as I know, he was the first really to point out the importance of hypergamy. The fact that women marry up, men marry down. That as he put it, if the woman doesn't acquire some kind of advantage from the union, the marital union or the union, the sexual union, then no union takes place. This is his.
That's Briffault's law.
Briffault's law, exactly.
Yeah.
Named after a
Yeah.
French anthropologist, I think.
He meant it to apply to the animal kingdom, and it's true that human marriage represents certain novelties, but it's also true that fundamentally we're animals. So yeah, it's probably best that most young men don't realize how self-interested female behavior is. I think fewer men would get married if they really understood uh, you know, the workings of Briffault's law and how women, women do not marry us because they love us and they're devoted to us. They marry us because they expect a benefit.
Well, and the conclusion that a lot of men nowadays seem to gather from hypergamy is that the women will flip from one man to another if they think they can get a better deal.
They do.
Yeah,
They
which is
they
obviously
do.
true. Yeah.
Yeah, it happens, although women's sexuality is more slow. We're producing billions of sperm every day and they ovulate once a month. So they won't go maybe from man to man quite as quickly. But practically every one thing that most men don't understand is practically every woman has a backup boyfriend or husband. Most women, even married women, they know what man they would glom onto if they lost their current man. They just, that's the way they are.
Interesting. Yeah, I see a lot of parallels between your work and I think Amneas's work and your work are quite consistent with one another. One of the things that
I
you
have
both,
read The Case for Father Custody, by the way. Yeah. I've
yeah, you
forgotten that he has a chapter on hypergamy in there, but yeah, it's not a term. Some people think I invented the term, which is not true at all. And it's been, I think I got it from Michael Levin's Feminism and Freedom, published in '88, and he cites a
huh,
text from the '70s. So,
right. Well,
yeah.
you both, one of the things that a parallel I saw was that you both emphasized that this is basically a reversion to a
Yes.
primitive form of reproduction, a primitive form of child rearing. From the monogamous two-parent family is the height of the most civilized, stable system that we've discovered so far, and we are diverging from that, and we are reverting to a more primitive form of child rearing, basically based on, I think, the mother-child dyad, or well, I don't know. You talked about this a bit in terms of the marital union, but it seems
That's right.
consistent. It seems consistent with the child rearing as well.
Yeah, the sexual revolutionists said that they didn't know what was going to happen. And they were right. They had no idea what was going to happen, how a sexually liberated society would function. Well, we've done the experiment, and now we know. It's
Yeah.
not, the sexual revolution was not a transition to some higher form of social organization, but simply a collapse back into the kind of behavior that can be seen in primitive tribes, hunter-gatherer tribes, and also ultimately in primate packs.
Yes.
We're mating like
Fascinating.
baboons, essentially.
Yeah.
Yes, and also I would like to address before we go the essay "Rotating Polyandry and Its Enforcers," in which you wrote about Michelle Langley's
Infidelity. Yeah.
female infidelity. Yes, and in that essay, and I just want to make it known that also the Hitting polyandry is not a strange term to my friends and I, considering what I said before. However, the statement was that from her is that American women do not want equality, they want revenge. So,
Yes.
can we have some explanation, if we do have it, where does this resentment and contempt come from?
Partly it's taught. It's actually inculcated by women's studies professors, many of whom are lesbians and just do not know how to deal with men. Partly, I think it's also disappointment, as in you just reread my essay on hooking up.
Mm.
Uh, women somehow young women imagine that if they can get the handsomest boy in the school into bed with them, they're going to live happily ever after. And that can't be the case when every other woman on campus wants that same young man. So they get hurt, they get hurt from these hookups, and they take it out not on the man who hurt them, but on men in general. And this is a sex difference. Women's anger is not as focused as men's. When women get angry at some man, they are liable to take it out on the next man they meet. Men learn you can't do that. No matter how much a girl has hurt you, you can't take it out on the next girl you meet. But a lot of, the poor guys, the poor average guys that finally start getting attention from these women who crashed and burned with the alpha males in their fertile years, they find themselves on the receiving end of all this bitterness. Women who are past 30 now are almost always bitterly disappointed. They're disappointed that Cosmo lied to them for all these years, that they're not getting the exciting romantic and sex lives that they were promised they could all get. And they're angry at the men who hurt them, and they're just angry at men in general. Sexual utopianism leads to disappointment. It leads to pain. And the longer you persist in your utopian hopes and expectations, the greater is going to be the come down from it. So a lot of women out there are really, really unhappy, and the unhappiness doesn't stay with them. They do take it out on men.
Yes, because I've actually, that is true. And I recall you discussing that also in one of your essays. You were discussing singles events in which, naive, innocent men, they'll go to these events and some of them have also lack of experience or relatively little experience. And they meet these women that already have all these miserable experiences.
Yes. Yes, yes,
So,
it happens. And I don't know if you guys have heard this, but I've actually uh come across like guys giving dating advice on in venues that are open to both men and women. And women will like call in and they will be so furious they can't even speak. They're so angry because they didn't get what they want in life that they can't even think straight anymore. And it can be quite shocking. I've encountered some very shocking examples of severe feminine rage that is not normal and is and you can see how no matter how unloved these women feel, how is any man going to love them?
mm,
You just can't love a woman who's constantly angry at you and angry at the whole world.
right.
So it's a bad situation.
Well, I see the only way out, and again, perhaps enforced monogamy is not as thrilling as this free for all, but some men I've spoken to, like for example, in some of these Twitter chats or online, or some guys I've spoken to in person in so-called real life, some of them have said, well, if we enforce monogamy, then women will just not marry. They either want to marry the top or they're not going to marry. So would enforced monogamy get us out of this? And I don't see enforced monogamy coming back anytime soon.
Well, there have always been women. Yeah, first of all, it's all right not to marry. This is a point that I've made. There have always been a minority of men and women who are not well cut out for marriage and actually prefer not to marry. As I said, strange as it sounds to modern ears, the Christian endorsement of celibacy as a legitimate voluntary choice actually represented a liberalization of sexual morality. In ancient Athens, a man did not have the right not to marry.
Mm.
If a woman, a freeborn female Athenian citizen, could not, no boys came calling, she was just, ill-favored or whatever, she could go to the archon, the magistrates of the city, and they would go and round up a bachelor for her. They would say, "You have to marry this woman."
Yes.
And to some extent that survived, even not as actual force, not as the force of law, but as late as the 1950s, like guys who just didn't marry were often looked upon as unserious. Uh, the presumption being that you could find a girl to marry you if you wanted to badly enough. And like sometimes bachelors would be denied promotions because people thought, well, if he's not married, he's not a responsible man. If he's not starting a family, he's not fully adult yet or something like that. So there was pressure on men and women, even kind of toward the bottom of the attractiveness scale, to find somebody and just get married.
Yes.
The great thing about marriage is you don't actually have to be glamorous to make a success of it.
Yes.
I tell people to watch the movie Marty that was made back in 1955 at
Um,
the high tide of American monogamy.
Yeah.
Joe Sobran once said, that marked the pinnacle of American monogamy. Having this movie about a plain man and a plain woman and how they actually succeed in securing a little bit of happiness in this world. They maybe don't have much, but they have each other.
Yeah, I saw that film. It's a good film. I recommend it. And I'm
Yeah.
going to list in our description. I'll list the articles and books and films we've mentioned. Swept Away, the Italian film,
Yeah.
which I watched also. And
Yeah.
I've seen that too. I remember that.
Yeah.
and Stephen, before we go, one more thing is that I remember, Cole, you wanted to address the term incel because incel.
Oh,
I mean, uh,
yeah.
before we used to call them bachelors, but to me, okay, I take it like this. The original definition of incel of this portmanteau is involuntarily celibacy. So that means that someone wants a mate but cannot find one. That's simply what it was originally, and then it became something else. Stephen, do you want to address that term?
Well, I don't know that I just have a question, a very simple question. Does it really exist? Do incels really exist, or is this something that is made up by the feminists and others to
Oh,
impugn?
I think it exists because, as I said, in primitive bands,
Yes.
60% of men do not succeed in fathering a child. They
Okay.
probably don't do any mating. See, marriage subjects women to two constraints that do not exist in nature. A woman can only choose a man who has not already been chosen by another woman, and the woman must stick to her choice.
Yes.
Neither of those neither of those exist in nature, and when feminists attack marriage, they're attacking those two constraints. They want to be able to mate hypergamously with the most attractive man they can find, even if another woman's got her, they want to be able to poach her and take her away, just as Helen Gurley Brown recommended in the pages of Cosmo. Go ahead, go after married men.
Mm.
And this is going to leave a lot of frustrated bachelors out there. Over half of the population, according to what anthropologists have observed in primitive tribes, it's over half the population of men that can't get mates under that situation. And that is a terrible, terrible. First of all, these tribes, it's not an accident that they're extremely primitive.
Yes.
Uh, but as I say, it's marriage that does not deny men all the sex they could otherwise get. It's marriage, the socially enforced institution of marriage, that gets sex and family and fatherhood for as many men as possible. That's one of the main reasons it exists, because the man's position is so weak. We can't control mating. So we have to subject women to these two artificial constraints to make it possible for ordinary guys to get a wife and start a family. So
So
yeah,
there's
incels are real. They're simply the re-emergent 60% of men lower in the status hierarchy. It is harder to get a woman today than it used to be before the sexual revolution. Not easier.
so basically there's two reasons why marriage primarily benefits men. One is the one you just outlined, and the second one is that marriage creates fatherhood. And we
Yeah.
didn't talk about that. That's a big topic, but I know
Yes.
you and I both quote Thomas Hobbes, as I recall, to
Yeah.
that
Yes.
effect.
Yes.
So maybe we could save that till the next show, next time
Yeah,
Well,
sure.
we do
sex and
that.
fatherhood. See, sex is something that in a healthy society, it's mainly the concern of young adults for a few years. After a few years of sex, you just morph into dad. And, it's important to remember that whether you marry or not, sex is a rather small part of a human life well lived.
Yes, I agree with that. Being a dad myself, I have two children, and there seems to be this obsession with sex, the topic of sex.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, sex is part of a marriage, but I do so much else with my life. I hang out with my friends, my
sure.
yeah, my in-laws, my mother's coming over today for her birthday, all sorts of things I'm involved in besides thinking of that all the time.
Right, right, right. And when marriage breaks down and large numbers of men can't get a woman, then naturally they're always going to be obsessing over sex and watching porn. That's where this comes from. Where we've actually gone from a society where everybody had a family to one where a large number of people are just obsessing over sex and putting, exaggerated hopes in it. And it's not, sex was never intended to make everything about sex is designed to benefit the race as a whole.
Yes.
If, yeah, it's not designed for individual happiness. And if you try to make it the basis of the happiness that you're seeking in life, you will be bitterly disappointed, even whether you marry or not.
Yes, I've observed that in some men up close, even including friends and former friends. You're right about that. So this has been a great, productive conversation. We'd love to have you again, Roger. And to
Okay.
our yes. So where could people find you? Where could people find your essays and books?
I have a Substack, and uh, my main publisher for this, I write about other subjects as well, ethnopolitics and other stuff. But my writing on sex and family issues has mostly been published through Countercurrents recently. They're the publisher of Sexual Utopia and Power. A new second edition is out with a couple of extra pieces in it now.
Hmm.
And they're going to be publishing a new collection of essays published last year. We're going to call it Not Hooking Up. And I hope that'll be out by this summer from Countercurrents. Where you can't find my work is on Amazon. I have been banned from Amazon. At least my Sexual Utopia has been banned from Amazon. You can buy it from Barnes and Noble or just go right to the publishers, Countercurrents, counter-currents.com.
Yes, thank you for that. I'll be listing all that in our description of this video. And to our audience, please subscribe if you want to get subject matter on sex, family, the male experience, male well-being that goes well below the surface of compared to your typical manosphere channel. So subscribe to the male space. Thank you for being with me today.
Thank you indeed,
Bye bye.
Roger.